Hello, I'm Corinna Howard and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello, welcome to episode 125 of the Monday Night Review. I hope you are all well. I had a rather fancy week last week. I do some social media work for a company and it was their Christmas party. We went to see Guys and Dolls in London at the Bridge Theatre and it was great. And I felt like a normal person. If you're a freelancer, you work for yourself, there's no Christmas parties or drinks after work or anything like that, so it was quite nice. Went out, it was all fancy, and we walked from Waterloo to London Bridge, and that's the kind of thing I miss about living in London. So all in all, it was great. I've got another meeting tomorrow in London. Updates as and when on how that goes. Thanks for your messages about last week's episode. This week's episode, usually I'll do an episode and I'll get quite into it and I'll research it, or I'll be reading books and making notes on lots of different things all at once. But this week's episode, I have gone to sleep thinking about it. I've woken up in the middle of the night thinking about it. And it's not that I'm keen to get it out of the way like I was when I did The Night Stalker, all that kind of thing. It's again, I always say it, it's like someone has given you a puzzle with no picture and you know you have all the pieces. That's how I feel. So I rarely think, oh, this is a case that I could go and explore more on, because I feel like there are much more qualified people than me. But this one, for loads of reasons, she's not that much older than me. She's 1 year older than my sister. Where it's set in Dorking in Surrey, I have family that lived there at the time that this took place. They lived in Dorking, this is outside Dorking, but it just feels so close and familiar and like, anyway, we'll get into it. I would like to give a couple of language warnings. One feels very silly to me, but I'm aware that there are people who find language a lot more tricky than I do. I rarely find language offensive. I'm going to use terms like geek and cool. I'm using that because I don't want to have to justify myself every time I say it by going, well, she was studious and wasn't that clued in on how to dress and got teased by kids who were more hip than... Do you know what I mean? I'm just going to say that she's a geek. I'm not saying it in a derogatory way. I certainly wasn't cool. I wasn't a geek either. But it should, using those terms, give you a clear insight into part of the personality of the girl that we're talking about today. There's also going to be a lot of talk about suicide. Now, not necessarily the act itself, but the psychology that goes into it. And for some people that might, I know, be problematic. So I just wanted to give you a heads up at the beginning. I am not qualified, but I speculate in this episode, and hopefully when we get to that point you'll understand why I speculate, because it's quite important. There's no graphic description of suicide or anything like that, but just a warning at the top. It's just one of those things that I feel needs to be talked about a lot in this episode. So today we're talking about Ruth Willson, the missing schoolgirl. There's actually quite a lot on the internet about this, but newspaper articles at the time, it's quite a local newspaper, and it all drops off. As you'll see, there was newspaper articles at the time and then nothing really, the odd appeal for information. There's a very interesting documentary called Vanishes, the Missing Surrey Schoolgirl with Leah Macaulay and Martin Bright, who I would say are the kind of experts in this case. So that makes for very interesting watching. It's on YouTube. I, of course, used Wikipedia. But so there's information out there, but there is a frightening amount of information missing, which I will get into. So Ruth Willson is the daughter of Ian and Nesta Willson. When Ruth was 3 and her sister Jenny was just a few months old, Nesta died from falling down the stairs and breaking her neck. Less than a year later, Ian marries Karen Bowerman in Surrey. So Nesta and Ian had been married in Newport. in Wales. And then Ian and Karen marry in Surrey, where they both work as teachers. So perhaps Nesta and Ian had moved to Surrey. I'm not entirely sure where they lived. This is all quite shady. We don't know. Not shady as in dodgy, but it just not a lot of information out there, which is absolutely fine. It's their private life. Ian was head of science at a secondary school and Karen was the deputy head of a primary school. Ian also served as a local parish councillor, and the family moved to a cottage in the village of Betchworth near Dorking. Ruth enjoyed reading, going on bike rides and music. She played the electric guitar and the piano. She had a Saturday job working in a music shop and was a popular local babysitter. She was great with kids. Families loved her. She was studying for her A-levels at the Ashcombe School sixth form and attended her local church, St Michael's, where she was a member of the choir, played the organ and also did bell ringing. So she's musical, she's active, she's part of the community. But, she's a teenager, 16, and she's still going to church, she's doing the bell ringing. She has a small but close-knit group of friends who occasionally are teased by the cool kids because they are studious, they read. So this is what I mean. They are more geeky. The cool kids tease them. School is the same all over the world. And if you see pictures of them, Ruth quite often wears these big glasses. A few people comment that her dress sense is unusual, and Ruth would go and hang out at her friends' houses. They would go on all-day bike rides. So they were, what I think is really sad quite often is when you find 13-year-old, 14-year-old, 15-year-old girls acting like grown-ups, and you think, looking back, I'm sure I was one of them, but looking back, you have all the time in the world to be a grown-up. You can never be 16 again. So, they're acting like children, which they are. In the autumn of 1995, when Ruth is 16, she tracks down her mother's death certificate and discovered that her mother had actually died by suicide and had hanged herself. We don't know what led to her not believing what she'd been told about her mother falling down the stairs. What conversation at home, if any, had triggered this need to confirm any suspicions she had. None of that we know. She never spoke to her father and stepmother about this. She only spoke to a friend about it. On the weekend of the 25th and 26th of November, Ruth spent a lot of time with her ex-boyfriend William, known as Will, with whom she still had a good relationship. He describes her as, quote, studious, well-mannered, traditional, with an unconventional dress sense. He says that she had no maternal influence to kind of help her navigate that time between girl and woman. And he says that when talking about her dress sense. So perhaps she is a little childish. But again, as I was saying earlier, that it is a difficult time as a girl or a woman because 16 is a child, especially the older you get. I look now at 16-year-olds and I'm like, oh God, you're so young. And some are younger than others. You have some that look 20, and you probably felt it at the time. I always looked really young. I had friends that looked much more grown up than me and they could get away with more. But, this is all helping us build this picture of Ruth. On the Saturday, Ruth had gone to work as usual, and then she'd gone out for a meal with Will and another friend of theirs called Neil. And Ruth had paid for the meal, and in some places I've seen it said that she told the boys, quote, something to remember me by. This isn't in all accounts, so I don't know if that's true. On Sunday, she went to church and then did handbell practice, and then she went to a youth group in Dorking, and then went and had supper at Will Kennedy's house. His family remembered that she was relaxed, normal, didn't seem upset about anything. On Monday the 27th of November 1995, Ian and Karen Willson left home before the kids. Ian had an Ofsted inspection at his school, so he was really stressed out, and he remembers pushing past Ruth as she stood listening to her Walkman and said, quote, "Out of my way, I'm in a hurry." That's the last thing he said to Ruth. Ruth and Jenny set out for the school bus. At the last minute, Ruth decides she's not going to go in, which wouldn't be unusual for her to not go in for the whole school day. She's in sixth form and therefore has free periods. There's more flexibility to her timetable. But the fact that she'd walked to the bus stop and then decided not to go at the last minute was unusual. To miss lessons was completely out of character. So Will drives past a bit later, offers Ruth a lift into school, and she says no, she'd see him later. Instead of school, Ruth takes a taxi to Dorking, and she gets there about 11:30. So we don't really know what happens between school bus time and when she gets this taxi. She probably got the taxi at about 11 or just after. We assume she went home. Don't really know. But she gets to Dorking at around 11:30, and about midday she goes into Thistle's florists on the high street and orders an expensive bunch of flowers to be delivered to her stepmother, specifying that they should arrive on the Wednesday of that week. She spends the afternoon in Dorking Library, and at 4 o'clock she takes a taxi from Dorking railway station to a bridle way entry near the Hand in Hand pub, which is now the Box Tree pub, on Box Hill. Box Hill is in the North Downs in Surrey. It's about 30 kilometres, 19 miles southwest of London, and lies in the Surrey Hills area of outstanding natural beauty. It is incredibly beautiful. As a side note, in 1963, great train robber Jimmy White hid £30,440, approximately 1/5 of his share of the stolen cash, in a caravan at Clovelly Caravan Park at the top of Box Hill. So it's as areas of outstanding natural beauty are, it's popular for walking, cycling, picnicking, horse riding. So it's not busy, but it's often walked. It's not sort of a remote area. The taxi driver noticed that after dropping Ruth off, she just stands by the side of the road, as if she didn't want him to look in the rearview mirror and see where she was going, or as if waiting for someone to pick her up. She doesn't turn and start walking up the track. And this is the last time that she's ever seen. Ruth at the time was wearing a red knitted jumper, black velvet trousers, black pixie boots, and a small lady's watch on her left wrist, and carrying a small blue duffel bag with a Walkman and tapes. Can't get more 90s than that. When she didn't arrive home, her parents became worried. They checked in with school and found out that she hadn't been there all day, which was incredibly out of character. She didn't miss classes, and it's then that they call the police. Surrey police seemed to track down the taxi driver quite quickly and focus their search on Box Hill. When the initial search didn't uncover anything, that night they organised a more extensive search with a helicopter, police dogs and heat-seeking equipment, and they still found nothing. Having spoken to her friends, they discovered that they quite often went to Box Hill, and she had been worried about her performance at school and had kept a school report from her father and stepmother that weekend. On Wednesday, the 29th of November, the bouquet of flowers arrived for Karen Willson. There was no note attached, but for Ruth's friend Catherine, she believes this was sent as a 2 fingers up to her stepmum. On the 1st of December, police found 3 notes hidden under a bush in the undergrowth at the top edge of Betchworth Quarry on Box Hill. The notes basically were farewells to her father, stepmother, her best friend, and a teenage boy she knew. We don't know who they are. I assume that the best friend is Catherine, and I assume that the teenage boy she knew is Will, but we don't know. Nearby was found empty packets of paracetamol tablets and a half-empty bottle of vermouth, if you prefer. The next day, a large-scale search is organised by the police, fire and rescue services, which included 60 volunteers comprising local members of the public, school friends, colleagues and wardens from the National Trust who own some of Box Hill. They use, again, a police helicopter, tracker dogs and thermal imaging equipment. A detailed search of the Betchworth Quarry end of Box Hill was taken and by search and rescue teams, and the owners of the quarry, but again, nothing was found. The family liaison officer, Mark Williams Thomas, who is now an investigative journalist and TV regular and is very good on TikTok actually, stated that no evidence was found to support suicide, and he was also sure that she wasn't abducted by a stranger. And when you first read that, you're like, but actually, I completely 100% agree. On the 8th of December, Ian and Karen went on This Morning to appeal for information, where they stated that they were concerned that she'd run away and was too scared to come home. This is interesting. Ruth's life is billed as a happy middle-class upbringing, home counties, beautiful area. No reason for her to be suicidal or want to run away. Later on, when journalist Martin Bright and ex-police officer Liam Macaulay dig deeper and speak to her friends, it would turn out this wasn't the case. And what was going on at home is still very unclear. 8 months after the disappearance, Catherine Mayer was visited at her new home in Sheffield. We'll talk about this in a minute. By South Yorkshire Police. And halfway through questioning, the officers break off and search her wardrobe as if she might be hiding Ruth in there. Then, on the first anniversary of the disappearance, a girl thought to resemble Ruth was captured on CCTV at a newsagent in Dorking. She was visibly distressed and requested a copy of each of the local newspapers, all of which referred to Ruth's disappearance and the fact that it was 1 year since she'd vanished. And she becomes visibly upset when she's told that the one in particular has sold out. Now, the shop owner found this very strange, so he actually went to the police, saved the CCTV footage, and later on, the Willsons stated in an article in The Times on the 2nd of January 1997 that they had watched this and believed that the girl on the video was Ruth. So what do we know? A studious girl is not doing well at school. She didn't want to give the report to her parents. What has happened to cause this downturn of academic performance? We know that she didn't say anything to her friends about being suicidal or having met someone new. She did, however, talk about leaving the area, starting a new life, getting out of her home, but she has nowhere to go. She has no older siblings. As far as we know, she's not close with any family elsewhere. We know that when she disappeared, she didn't have a coat. It's November. She didn't have a coat, she didn't have passport, she didn't have spare clothing with her. She literally just had this duffel bag. I had a backpack in the 90s. It had books, Walkman and tapes, obviously, and fags. And that was it, and my wallet. So we can assume that she had similar, possibly without the fags. She had her bank card with her. This was never used. She is wearing a bright red jumper with a bright blue duffel bag, both of which would be noticeable against the undergrowth, even I would think for many years following, because it's an area of outstanding natural beauty. There's not a lot of litter, stuff stands out. So it's not like she's wearing unrecognisable, unnoticeable clothing. We know that she is an unhappy, possibly unstreetwise child. She's not close to her parents. And we know that that is a good target for someone with nefarious intentions. In 2006, Ian Willson, the father, wrote an open letter to his missing daughter, imploring her to come home and asking if anyone had information about her whereabouts. In 2018, ex-terrorist police officer Liam Macaulay and journalist Martin Bright joined forces for a documentary on the disappearance called Vanished, the Surrey Schoolgirl. Macaulay retired nearby and became interested and then kind of really focused in on this case. He was refused access to the files by the police as it is an ongoing investigation, officially a missing persons case, as there's no evidence of any other crime. He wrote a letter to the family offering to speak to them and try and help them, and received no response. Now, I understand that people need to get on with their lives. They might be very private. But I couldn't move past needing to know what had happened to my child. Someone with credentials, which I would think a retired police officer would have, he's a tough man, offering to investigate my missing child for me. I'm assuming free of charge. You know, he is interested, he is invested in this case, would be an absolute yes for me. And lots of people on YouTube are like, yeah, they're entitled to their privacy, blah, blah, blah. When Liam first got in contact with them, there was no documentary being made. It wasn't to make anything public. It's literally just I'm going to write to the parents and see if I can help, and didn't receive any response. And to me, that is strange. And I understand, you know, not trusting people. You can get your lawyer to check people out. That you know, I just feel like I would need help to find my child. It would only be 7 years later that Macaulay would get in contact with Martin Bright, who had originally written about Ruth's disappearance. Lee Macaulay believes that someone in the community is responsible and knows what happened to Ruth. As he points out, there's been no activity on her bank card. There's been no activity on her medical records, dental records. She didn't have a passport. So, did a 16-year-old create a whole new identity for herself? No. And people don't just vanish into thin air. What also becomes apparent is that Macaulay and Bright both feel that there was no one fighting Ruth's corner, which is very interesting, and I think partly what it feels like such a pull to this case. The family didn't want to be involved in the documentary, which is absolutely fair enough. And the village of Betchworth won't talk to them for the documentary without the go-ahead from Ian Willson, which, again, I understand. But it sort of feels like 2018 is a long time after she disappeared, but has this been going on since she disappeared? And who's looking for her? Who is caring enough about needing to find out what has happened to her? They tracked down and speak to William Kennedy, Ruth's ex that she remained good friends with and spent time with that weekend before she disappeared. And he said, although he thought it was strange, it hadn't affected him that deeply. He did say that he believed somebody else got involved in her disappearance. Macaulay does too. He points out that she was, quote, dressed to get into another car, which I think is a very interesting way of putting it and true way of putting it. But you realise that the ex-boyfriend, her friend, is saying, you know, it hasn't affected him that much. Her friend, who I think was her best friend, Catherine, was also unhappy at home. She moved to Sheffield, and Ruth had a number of times said could she move with her, and Catherine was focused on her own stuff, so had said no. So she's got a best friend who's moving away. She's got whatever's going on at home. She's got an ex-boyfriend. And I think, you know, when people don't care that much about you. And who is trying to find Ruth? Who is worried enough about Ruth to be asking questions? There are some people. Macaulay and Bright managed to speak to Kay and Roxy, her friends from school. Roxy had in fact gone public in 2010, asking for any key information. Kay and Roxy gave some insight into Ruth at school and the impression that they'd got from her home life. Ruth's friends were not the cool kids. In fact, they were occasionally bullied by the cool kids. They were more geeky, not trendy dresses. They were into books and bike rides. And it was just nice to get a sort of feel that they were still thinking of her. Ruth is 4 years older than me. She's 1 year older than my sister. I can imagine what type of girls they are. I look at pictures of Ruth and she's familiar to me because of that age difference and being a teenager in the 90s. She feels familiar to me, and I probably would have been mean to her at school. But I also know that type of girl tended to stick to her guns and be stubborn and successful at what she wanted to do. What Kay and Roxy can't understand, and I agree, is that if she was alive, why wouldn't she have got in touch with someone after one of the appeals? She didn't have to give information about where she is. She doesn't have to be in contact with her family. She can just let someone in the police or on the missing persons line know. You can phone up and say, I'm Ruth Willson. I disappeared on this day from this place. I'm fine. I don't want to be in contact with my family. I've started a new life. And then everyone knows. And Kay and Roxy know her well enough to, I think, know that she's the type of person that would do that. And I think especially if Roxy had done an appeal and Roxy was friends with her in 2010, that would be a time that Ruth would say, okay, shit, my friend from school is still worried about me, so I'm going to get in contact. But they haven't heard anything. Kay and Roxy believed that she was planning to do something, whether she'd be away from home for a while. She intended to go missing, but not like this. There was a dance coming up and they thought, she's going to burst into this dance and she's going to have had everyone worried and it's going to be like a dramatic re-entrance. And I slightly wonder if that was the case, whether she was aware that Will, wasn't that invested in her and, she wanted to give everyone a scare and make them miss her. And something went terribly wrong. Macaulay and Bright also get in contact with Catherine, who was, I believe, Ruth's best friend at the time of her disappearance. And in fact, Catherine left home just before Ruth ran away, or just before Ruth disappeared, and moved to Sheffield. They were bonded through their unhappy home life, though Catherine stayed in touch with her family, calling 2 or 3 times a week. And it's Catherine's mother who tells her that Ruth has gone missing. Catherine's mother remembers how unhappy Ruth was, and the last time that she'd gone to their house, just before Catherine left, Ruth really didn't want to go home, and she didn't say why, but it was vehement enough to actually really disturb and unsettle Catherine's mother. And she says, as a mother, I found it very difficult. Catherine knew that Ruth had just found out how her mother died. And in the documentary, she said, quote, her whole childhood was based on secrecy and lies. And after the documentary comes out, the Willsons release a statement saying that this is not how her childhood was. So that's something else that's strange. We've got one thing from her friends and one thing from her family. Interestingly, Catherine thinks she had, quote, every intention of killing herself, though she hadn't talked about suicide. She was very distressed about finding out about her mother. She thinks that the flowers were 2 fingers up to her stepmother and that it was this sort of stubborn move to commit suicide. Interestingly, in the documentary, there is no mention of the letters found, the paracetamol or the vermouth that were found 3 days later on Box Hill. And I find that very interesting. What's notable about this case is the remarkable lack of curiosity from people involved. The police seem to be, are they worried about their conduct being judged? They don't seem to want any input in this, but they don't seem to be working it themselves. The family, of course, they don't have to be public. They don't have to do a TV episode, but they've been turned down any contact with Liam Macaulay, who initially contacted them, and they don't seem to be. If you look at the McCanns, obviously a very different circumstances, but in the face of being constantly accused of their daughter's disappearance, the McCanns have tirelessly, whatever you think of them, searched for their daughter and campaigned, and the Willsons, there just seems to be, I don't know, and of course my judgment is clouded by my experience of motherhood, and not everyone experiences parenting the same way, but for me to have a child out there and for me to not know where they are or what happened to them, I as I said earlier, I would want any help. So I have loads of questions about this. I want to know, who does she go up to Box Hill with usually? Was it Roxy and Catherine and Kay? Did they bike ride? What were they doing up there? It says that they went up there frequently. My friends and I would have gone up there frequently to smoke cigarettes. My friends would have drunk. I didn't drink when I was younger. So is that what they were doing? But not, because I think they're geeks. So I would be interested to know. Because also it gives us an indicator of, were they hanging out with certain people? Did they meet certain people? Was it a regular meeting spot that somebody could have noticed her at and met her at? And do you know what I mean? So I want to know that. I want to know, she's wearing this red jumper, and I'm assuming it has never been found. Has anyone ever found a red jumper on Box Hill? I have certain questions and assumptions that I've made about the psychology of suicide. As I've said, I'm not a psychologist. In my mind, if she had decided to commit suicide, why wait? She goes and I could understand going and sending the flowers, but then she goes to the library for the afternoon, and then she gets a taxi. She's not wearing a coat. Is wearing a coat or not wearing a coat significant in the psychology of suicide? In November, do we know where she bought the vermouth? Did she steal it from home? Did she buy it? Is it even linked to her? There's just questions like that I have. Is it not more like she was meeting someone than committing suicide? I also wonder if the vermouth, she's clever. She's clever. And I think a girl doing her A-levels would know that paracetamol and vermouth is not enough to commit suicide. So how else was she planning on doing it? Did she have anything else with her to complete suicide? And also, you'd have to be remarkably clever to numb yourself with paracetamol and vermouth, which I think at most would do some damage to your liver. But then conceal yourself to complete suicide so well that dogs, helicopters, search parties cannot find you. We also know that she was involved with her local church. So how did she view suicide? What is making her unhappy at home? Usual stepmother stuff? Something else? Something sinister? Or nothing at all? And by nothing at all, I mean, I had a friend who just found 14, 15, 16, 17 incredibly difficult and raged, and I can think of two off the top of my head, raged against their parents and fought with their parents and hated their parents. And I was at their houses a lot, and they would fall out with their parents over nothing. And it was very kind of awkward to be around, because you were like, dude, your mum's being really nice and you've just lost your shit, and I can't understand why. And being a teenager is incredibly difficult. I also want to know what her relationship is with Jenny. I couldn't, even if I had a problem with my parents and I needed to leave and I wanted to start a new life, I would need to let my sister know that I was okay. And I wasn't particularly close with my sister when we were teenagers, although we've always been close. But I have a sibling responsibility, and I think she'd feel the same. We need to know where each other are and that we're okay. And so I wonder what her relationship was like with Jenny. And I wonder what her relationship was like with her stepmom, because it's very different as a step-parent, I should imagine, being brought into the home with an 8-month-old, 12-month-old who has, no, sadly for her, no recollection of her birth mother, and frankly, 8-month-old babies are divine. As opposed to a 3 or 4-year-old who is probably very upset about the death of her mother and has those memories and maybe can start having resentment. So we don't know what that relationship is. And we don't know whether, I don't think her being unhappy at home necessarily means that there was something suspicious going on at home. I think it could be that she just found being a teenager difficult, and she just was finding life difficult, and that's okay. But I find that intriguing. I want to know why there's not more information on the letters found. We don't know what was in them. We don't know who exactly they were addressed to. Some say they were sort of goodbye letters, but are they goodbye letters in a suicidal way or in a going away way? Why are they found 3 days later after the initial search? What was the weather like? How were they wrapped? That kind of thing. I just want to know, how did they not get damaged by the weather? Why were they not found? Were they planted there later? You know? Ruth had also apparently travelled to London to find her mother's death certificate. This is quite savvy. I would say that the train from Dorking to London is about half an hour, but then you've got to go from Waterloo to Somerset House. And, that's quite... There's no internet, or there is internet. It's the birth of internet. But she didn't have a smartphone. She probably she wouldn't have had a mobile phone. She didn't even have a passport. So it's quite a savvy thing to be doing. She is studious. She does go to the library. She knows her way around. But did nobody notice that? When did she go? Did she go to London often? I think if she was waiting for someone on this bridleway where she'd been dropped off, which is on the side of the road, it's just the start of a bridleway, just so you can picture it. She's not wearing a coat. I believe it was raining. It points to a third party having dropped the letters off, and perhaps the vermouth and paracetamol. And we don't know that the vermouth and paracetamol was even hers. And they say packets of paracetamol, but how much? And if you're going to say you're going to cause death by vermouth and paracetamol, where are you going for that? It's not going to be quick. There's so many bits that don't fit right that the police could probably answer. And there's no reason why I have to know about it. But it seems that nobody knows about it, and nobody is putting these pieces of the puzzle together. And I think that's what I find so upsetting, is that who is? You've got a journalist and an ex-police officer both chomping at the bit to solve this. You've got friends who want to know what happened, and the police won't tell anyone any information, but they don't seem to be putting the pieces of the jigsaw together themselves. And there's this distressed girl that just disappeared, and I don't believe she committed suicide. At least if she committed suicide, I don't believe she did it on Box Hill. And if she didn't do it on Box Hill, then why get the taxi to Box Hill? And who was she waiting for? Because as Liam Macaulay says, as Matthew Dudar says, who was the family liaison officer, it's not a stranger. She's not waiting to be, initially, a lot of places where I've read this, they've compared it to the disappearance of Millie Dowler, who we now know what happened to her, but she was targeted and picked up by a serial killer. She's going somewhere to meet someone, or she's going somewhere to complete suicide, but she's not wearing a coat. She doesn't walk up the path as far as we know. So who is she meeting? She's not going there to meet a stranger. And yet it's strange that she didn't mention to anyone that she'd met a new friend, or she was, seeing someone, But then, as I said earlier, if she's a distressed teen, she's not happy at home, something's going on at school, she is prime for a predator to say, you can't tell anyone that we're meeting up because they won't understand, and it will be our secret, and blah, blah. And that means it's someone local. It's someone who knew her and could build trust with her. And that is disturbing. But has anyone been looked into? Has anyone... I just want to know. And I feel that that's what's really frustrating for everyone who has looked into this case is has that been done? If that's been done, great. But it feels like it hasn't. Has anyone been looked into in the local area? I just find it problematic. We don't know what happened to Ruth Willson. She's been spotted as far away as Canada. We know that she didn't have her passport. I don't believe she even had a passport. She definitely didn't have it with her. She didn't pack to leave, which points towards suicide. But I think it's much more likely that someone said to her, why don't we give everyone a real fright and disappear for a couple of days? And she went willingly. And whatever happened, happened. In terms of the sighting of her a year after she disappeared, it absolutely, of course, could be her. But I would think that everyone was looking for her. Her face had been on the front page of all the local newspapers. She went to a sixth form college there. It'd be very difficult for her to go about Dorking and not be recognised or noticed. Has she been kept by someone and allowed out for the day and doesn't have the ability to be free from them? There are so many questions and really, really few answers. And that is the story of Ruth Willson, the missing schoolgirl. As you can tell, probably from my just raised so many more questions than answers. And I would wake up in the middle of the night and say, if you're going in November in the dark up a hill to complete suicide, would it matter if you had a coat? Would you not wear a coat because it didn't matter that you were going to get wet? Or would you wear a coat because you wouldn't want to die cold? That's been my brain at 4 o'clock in the morning. I'd love to know what you think. Yeah, I think this is going to be one that I can't leave. So yeah, email me, themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. You can come and join the Patreon, make me very happy. You can follow the link down below. There's also merch available. You can get a Pod Dog t-shirt, my personal favourite. You can get an MNR t-shirt, which is so cool. My friend designed it. She's amazing. And you can find us on social media at the Monday Night Review, and I'll put pictures up so you can see. I always think it helps to get visuals when you're listening to a podcast. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.